St. Ignatius called his prayer practices exercises. And so it's a good word because exercise makes you healthy. And I think 30 minutes walk a day would probably make the whole world happier and healthier. That's what they say. So we have our exercise walking up the hill, but also there's an exercise in some of the little practices we're doing, which I'll just remind you about as you settle in, as I hope you're feeling you've arrived. Your feet are touching the ground, you're feeling that you belong here, the place is welcoming you. It is as it has welcomed meditators for 25 years, but also pilgrims for 700 years. So another exercise is the restraint of speech, keeping silent until, unless it's necessary, and until dinner time, and then resuming that silence, restraint of speech, as we walk down the hill after dinner. Just keep that in mind. And generally, it's usually in those sort of moments of transition when you're coming out of something, out of the meditation room, moving to the next thing on the agenda. It's usually then that restraint drops. You just have to whisper something to someone, so you whisper it to the person next to you or the person you're sharing a room with or whatever. So try and keep that awareness. I'm going to be speaking about awareness this morning as a part of our understanding of health. So just try to keep that exercise of silence continuous. And stability. Just remaining... Domugo, welcome. Domugo is here, and I won't point him out because he's saying not to, so don't look around. But you may see him on the way out, and he's very kindly, as I said yesterday, offered to show us the cloister and the frescoes, and maybe the library as well, before the end of the week. So then the stability within the grounds. It's a big ground. It's a big space here, the monastery, very beautiful places to walk. So, or walk up to Chiusure or wherever. But try to keep the center of gravity, the center of attention, physically, geographically, in the space here. I put a list of times for meetings upstairs, so you can just tick off beginning this afternoon. So you can just put your name down if you'd like to do that. So, back to health. What do we mean by health? We all want to be healthy, although not always. There are people who sometimes seem to want to be sick. We don't usually admit it, but there can be a little demon in us that prefers to be sick than to be healthy for a number of reasons. Maybe we avoid something that we have to face. What was that ringing noise?
Sorry, I'm trying to record and it's gone wrong.
Oh, okay.
I'm going to have to get it.
Okay. So it may be you want to avoid something, or hypochondria is a sort of a condition that we may all fall into at times. And there also, as Saint Benedict understood, there's also the danger that you like the attention that you get when you're sick. Now, nothing wrong in liking the attention, but there's something a bit wrong about wanting to be sick so that you get the attention. So, when we say we all want to be healthy, that's generally true, but we should recognize some exceptions to that. And it might make us aware that health isn't quite what we think it is. St. Benedict says, just on that point, he says that the sick should receive special attention as other people who are in need, like old people or visitors arriving or children. And like these people who are vulnerable and in a needy condition, we should give them special attention, welcome them as Christ himself. But then he sort of adds, as Benedict does, he always sees the other side of something. He says, however, the people who are sick, who are getting this attention, shouldn't let it go to their heads and make unreasonable demands upon the people who are looking after them. Usually, health is defined negatively, being without pain, for example. The World Health Organization came up with a couple of definitions of health, which are interesting expressions of a certain cultural idea of health and a medicalized idea of health. The level of functional or metabolic efficiency of a living organism, free from illness, injury, or pain. So, efficient and free from illness, injury, or pain. So, how long have you ever been healthy for, in that case? Rather idealized, and maybe we might say a rather mechanized view of health, taking a sort of mechanical model to describe the human person. It's not much worse, though, than another definition, which is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So again, rather idealized idea of health, that there will be complete physical, mental, and social well-being. Well, that's a tall order. That used to be called the kingdom of God. And not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. Anyway, these, I think, represent rather medicalized or idealized views of what health means. It doesn't bear much relationship to our own experience of health. We are rarely as metabolically efficient as in the first definition, and if we are probably, as soon as we realize that we are in this state of metabolic efficiency, we begin to wonder how long it will last. So very quickly we become subject to fear or anxiety or insecurity about this efficiency that we call health. And the awareness and the fear of death is never far from the surface. We repress the fear of death, of course, and there's a difference between repressing it and suppressing it. Psychologically, it's said to be our deepest repression. We just push it out of mind because we don't want to think about it. But St. Benedict, again, has another approach to it. St. Benedict says, always remember that you're going to die. Keep it constantly before your eyes. Now, he doesn't mean go around thinking about death all the time, but don't repress it. And of course, the purpose of not repressing it, then you naturally will suppress it, because you will be turning your attention to whatever it is you're doing, your prayer, or your work, or your reading, whatever it is, that's what you're giving your attention to at that time. So you're not thinking, oh, I'm going to die at some moment, I don't know when it's going to be. That would be morbid. But Benedict is not being morbid, he's expressing a universal spiritual practice, really, which you find in Buddhism and elsewhere, of keeping, being memento mori, being aware, being mindful of the fact that you're mortal. And the consequence of that is that you're free. All of that energy that goes into the repression of the fear of death is set free. So now you can spend it. It's like all your money is tied up in something that's not earning any interest, or is just being eroded. Your capital is being eroded, and now you're suddenly being flooded with liquid funds that you can spend as you like. You can now give all this energy to something creative and positive and happy. So we have periods of health, of course, maybe even periods where we come very close to this metabolic efficiency. But health cannot really be defined negatively by what it is not. Why should the awareness and the acceptance of death, for example, why should that bring us to a fuller sense of wholeness? Well, I think because it is part of the whole picture, and it needs to be integrated. We need to have a certain conscious space that is aware of our mortality, and even aware of the complete unpredictability, the randomness of our mortality. We don't know at any moment when we might die. So there should be a certain space in our available consciousness in which we welcome and accept this element of our mortality. And that makes us more whole, more integral. And the fact that the awareness and the acceptance of death and the things we associate with it, like suffering and loss, these are not easy things to face. But if we do, the evidence is, from a great deal of research done with those who are dying, quite surprising. The evidence is that those who are dying, who have their basic physical needs cared for, their pain taken care of, and their psychological needs being met, in other words, they're maybe tying up the loose ends of their lives, or reconciling with their relatives who they haven't spoken to, or saying sorry, or whatever, that if this natural physical and psychological work is being done, then the people who are dying, who have now accepted that they're dying, will say, I've never been happier. It's quite amazing. There was a book I just read recently, not a great book, but it was I forget the name of the man. It was one of Tony Blair's political associates, and he was a politician all his life, and then he got I think leukemia, and went through quite long stages of treatment. Eventually had to face his inevitable mortality, and then he describes with remarkable sort of innocence, really, this explosion of joy. And he was happy, he loved his family loved him, he didn't want to leave them, but he couldn't deny this upwelling of joy and fullness, wholeness, which, if that isn't healthy, what is? So he was as unhealthy as you can get by the World Health Organization definition. He was about to die, so ultimate failure of the medicalized view of health. At the same time, he was never happier, never more whole, never more loving, never more human in his life, by his own powerful self-description. So health, we might say then, is better understood positively as an experience of wholeness that incorporates even what seems like its opposite: sickness, suffering, and death. These would normally be said to be unhealthy or opposed to health. But actually, acknowledging and accepting them doesn't mean you go looking for them, but accepting them when they are there seems to be an essential part of the healing process and leads us to a greater wholeness and a greater health. And the medicalized view of health, metabolic efficiency of a living organism, doesn't really compute that. Certainly can't be measured. How do you measure something as paradoxical and yet as universally experienced as that? It's rather like the placebo effect. 30% in general, I was told last night at dinner, 70% for gastrointestinal conditions, the placebo effect. So we call it the placebo effect because we don't know what it is. We can't measure it. Well, I suppose we can measure it in that respect, that people who are under a placebo study will reflect those figures. But we don't know, we can't measure really and understand what it is. So, that just because you can't measure it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Perhaps sport gives us another insight into what we mean by health and wholeness. Like the ancient Greeks, we admire the human body at its most beautiful, fast, agile, strong, and athletic. Look at the Greek statues. And today still, look at the attention, the huge amount of coverage sport gets, and the heroes, the gods that we make out of our successful athletes. The sportsmen and sportswomen who reach physical excellence and had the control of mind also, of course, that inner discipline to be able to use that physical excellence to perform at a peak level are as close as we come to an idea of the gods. This is certainly how the Greeks really saw them. And we're not so different from that. If you look at any newspaper or watch any TV program. So we all admire the Nelson Mandelas and the Mother Teresas of the world for different qualities, but hardly more, if you were to measure it, certainly on a popular scale, than the great athletes or the basketball players. You know, something in us responds in admiration, maybe even in envy a little bit, but mostly in admiration, I would say. I think there's envy of the gods because you know you're human, and that's why you admire these individuals. But recently, we've been educated to look at a less idealized form of sports divinities in the Paralympics. And now we watch men and women in wheelchairs or with artificial limbs performing extraordinary feats. Not going as fast or jumping as high, I suppose, as in the regular Olympics, but we bring a different kind of admiration. I mean, maybe a certain level of this of physical admiration, of course, but also even more admiration of the character and the determination and the spirit of the people who had dealt with their disabilities so incredibly and courageously. Acknowledging and accepting in themselves what would make most of us despair or withdraw from life. Well, there may be some voyeurism in that, but I think essentially there is we've been educated there's some progress culturally in being able to watch the Paralympics with not just the Greek sort of worship of the perfect body or the perfect metabolic efficiency, but actually looking at a person who is accepting, acknowledging and accepting and transcending or integrating the very things that for most of us would represent failure or a cause for despair. And those stories of those athletes just inspire and elevate us. So then perhaps we understand from that example how health is not just the absence of problems, pains, or disabilities, but health is our capacity for wholeness, in which everything, including illness or disability, can and must be integrated, including the very things that we find and fear most undesirable: sickness, suffering, and failure. And that, I think, helps us to understand why meditation is a healthy practice, why it contributes to health at every level of our humanity. Now, we know from the benefits that meditation brings and some research that has been done, it's very variable research, but research being done into the physical benefits of meditation, that it is good for you physically, and that can be measured. But we also know that it has a very strong impact upon our psychological health and well-being. And as soon as we begin to be sensitive to the spiritual dimension, we can begin to understand how meditation promotes, if you like, spiritual health as well. Our experience of meditation at all levels and dimensions teaches us this meaning of health as our capacity for wholeness from day one. You may start off as an idealistic meditator. You may have an image of yourself as a kind of athletic meditator. You know, you're going to get a gold medal for your meditation. You're going to be on the front page of the newspapers. Your spiritual body is going to be absolutely perfect. And then very quickly, of course, that image is shattered by the discovery of what you, first of all, label as failure. That's how you call it, because it is a failure of the ideal. It's like that ideal image of health breaks down as soon as you begin to look at it in terms of real experience. So this ideal of meditation that you may have, it may be encouraged by the fact that the practice is very simple. That breaks down very quickly because you simply realize that you're not doing it very well, that the mantra is confronting you from the first moment with your chronic distractedness, with your unbalanced mind. You didn't even realize, perhaps, that your mind was so distracted and so unbalanced. And there's no cheating with this. You can't, in sport you can cheat a bit, or you can take drugs or steroids or whatever, but you can't really cheat with meditation, because the only person who's watching you and applauding from the stands is you. Well, not actually you, it's your ego. So you're really performing for your ego, which is not a very good audience. So it takes a little time to realize that drama is happening. And you have to decide if you want to play in that drama or not. We'll come back to that in a minute. We usually, for those of you who haven't been here before, just to wake you up at this point, we usually go and do a little run around the courtyard, which Giovanny is in charge of. So, it's warm enough, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. So that's what we do, is we just do a little mindful walk, and he'll restore us to our senses by doing that. When I was, many years ago, when I was in the lay community, we had this chap arrived, young guy arrived from India, and he sat in the most perfect posture, gave us a very silent guy, very centered, and vegetarian on top of that, and gave us all a real sense of, we were just amateurs really. And the only slight suspicious thing about him was he was a little on the plump side. And once, as I was walking down by the shops, I saw him sitting in a restaurant with a huge, with 2 hamburgers and about 3 cream cakes waiting for his dessert. So, anyway, so we can try to cheat, but ultimately you can't cheat yourself, your true self. So, to begin to meditate really is to confront in a way that's both challenging but also, wonderfully refreshing. It's a great discovery that you can be, in some moment of the day and in some aspect of yourself, completely truthful, completely honest. And that must involve your recognition and acceptance of the fact that you're not a perfect meditator. So the first thing that has to be driven out of you is the virus of perfectionism. This feeling that we should be perfect, we should all look like these gold medal athletes, or we should all be Mother Teresa's, that this virus of perfectionism has to be eradicated, really. And the daily meditation is like your antibiotic. It just gets rid of it. We've all been infected by it religiously. The idea of perfectionism, of course, is that you may be saved, in which case you're on the perfectionists' camp, or you will be damned, and you're in the imperfect group, and God is constantly selecting the perfect from the imperfect, and that has been injected into a secular society, I think today, by our idea of success. We have to be successful. We have to conform to certain standards of excellence or success, and we maintain those appearances of success throughout our career in order to be competitive. So perfectionism or the obsession with success is the first thing that has to be confronted, because it's the most primitive enemy, really, of the journey to wholeness that we have embarked upon. So we have to get rid of, or confront this one right at the beginning. What we discover, of course, very quickly is distraction. Distraction is first of all felt as a failure. We would like to sit there with clear and open minds. We've had maybe brief moments or some taste of what a calm and clear and tranquil mind would be like. And we might accept from what we've read and feel that this is really the condition of pure prayer. We probably have begun at least to accept that prayer is not just about mental operations, words, liturgy, external forms of worship, petition, intercession, or praise. Those are forms of prayer, of course, which are perfectly necessary and valid. But as soon as we begin to realize that they are not prayer, but forms of prayer, as John Main says, prayer is our entry into the only prayer there is. Actually, we heard a little bit from Gregory of Nazianzen in the reading just before, I think it was it Vespers or midday prayer yesterday, where he says everything is praying. Everything in the cosmos is praying or moving towards prayer, to this state of exultant fullness, or fullness of health, you might say, which it is flourishing, which it is pouring out its own being. So this is prayer, the cosmic praise. And for John Main, this is why we can say in a Christian understanding of this universal truth that it is not my prayer that matters. Christians can be very egocentric about their prayer, and it's my prayer and my shopping list to God and my keeping, prodding God as if he was like some very busy, important executive. You have to keep reminding God that he should be doing some things for you. But it's that the essential prayer in the Christian understanding is the prayer of Christ. It is his relationship or his state of being with the Father, this deepest ontological, this deepest structure of reality that into which we are led by our setting our focus on him. Once we turn to him and begin to follow him, and we become his disciples, then that's the way in which we're pointing. That's the way we're heading. And that's where this relationship is a healing relationship, of course. This is where it's going to take us into this ultimate experience. So we may have some sense of what all this is about, and then we sit to meditate and we're thinking about dinner, or our diet, or our bank balance, or the TV programs we're missing this week, or a argument that's running in our life, or a bad relationship, or a sadness, or a grief, or a anger, or bitterness, or an addiction some craving we find in ourselves. So whatever it may be, that's what we find ourselves focused upon. And we might then conclude, well, this is really a bit uncomfortable, it's a bit too real, I can't do it. And that's where, of course, we need friendship, support, community, and we may well give up many times, but each time that we come back, each time we start again, we come back a little stronger. The exercise of returning is what strengthens us. It's like the resistance in any physical exercise. It's that giving and returning that strengthens the muscle. Distraction, we could almost say, is a form of mental illness. Doesn't mean we're mad, or that we are chronically, neurotic, but you could say if health is this purity of heart and this ability to pay attention and to enter into the prayer of the Spirit and into this cosmic prayer, if that's health, wholeness, the holiness of the one who is holy, then you could say, I wouldn't push the case too much, but you could say then that distraction itself is a kind of ill health. And the desert teachers came quite close to this, really, as they considered the state of distraction in which the human mind finds itself at the beginning of this journey. And they virtually came to the conclusion that this is the same as original sin. It's a mysterious thing that we should growing up or being conditioned by this culture that we've created, which is a hyper-distracted culture, is one extreme. But even in any culture, even out in the deserts of Egypt where they found themselves, they discovered that this is the reality that the mind, the person finds themselves in. And it's in a sense, no fault of your own. I mean, certainly for us, because everything for us is about 100 times or 1,000 times greater than it was in the past. The scale has increased so immensely. But even for us, in our hyper-distracted state, and we can recognize the state of distraction, and we can, perhaps the first thing we have to do, the very first thing we have to do, before we start thinking too much about the goal and the ultimate wholeness or the ultimate health of the state of prayer, the first thing we have to do is to begin to break some of our addictions to distraction. I was teaching in a business school earlier this year, and I was it was a kind of experimental thing really. I wasn't sure how it would go and what the motivation of these MBA students, second year MBA students, so about 27, 28-year-old. I wasn't sure what their motivation really was. Maybe they thought the meditation course, meditation and leadership, was a sort of easy course for them to do and a little more fun than marketing, accountancy, or, I don't know, trade surpluses or something. But in fact, I realized quite quickly that they were very serious about it and they were very dedicated to it. They really took up the practice. I said to them at the beginning, your course commitment is that you should meditate twice a day for the next 6 weeks. And they achieved that to about 73%, which I thought was very good. And they liked to be measured, so we gave them a way of measuring it. So, and a few of them did 100% because they got it immediately. They fell into it. It was quite amazing. When you create that disciplined structure, it was a kind of a purpose, like the monastery, for example. When you're in that framework, if you go into it, then the expectations are there and the support structure is there. So you're more likely to do it and put your good intentions into practice because everything is oriented towards that. Depends what the monastery is set up to do, of course. But the same is true in a sense of the meditation group. It's only, in a sense, a weekly group. But people find a great deal of support and inspiration and encouragement to their daily practice by belonging to that group. So I think we need to set ourselves up to succeed, and we need the support and encouragement of others to do it. That's community. Well, so it was really encouraging to see how they responded to this. And by the end of the course, how much they felt that it had touched them deeply, and I met them a few weeks or a few months after the course finished, and the ones I met had said, this is part of my life now. Maybe not meditating twice a day, as often as I was during the course, but I am doing it. Anyway, the lowest scoring student in the course, papers were not very enthusiastic, and his meditation performance was about 20%. So I had formed, as I shouldn't have done, but formed a certain image of him. But then when I met him and talked with him, as I did with each of them, I realized he probably got more out of the course than anybody else. Because he said, I know that I haven't done very well, and blah, blah. He said, I've discovered something that has been quite shocking, and that is that I am totally addicted to distraction. And he said, I can see it when I go home into my apartment every evening. I open the door. The first thing I do is I put on every device, electronic device I can find. And it's playing, it's it's online, everywhere. And he said, when I go to bed at night, the last thing I do is I hold in my phone, I check my messages, and then I fall asleep holding the phone. When I wake up in the morning, I don't know about every morning, but anyway, this one, and when I wake up in the morning, the first thing I do is check my messages. So he said, I think that's addiction, don't you? So he was, and that's a great, that's the first step. If you can't, if you can't see that, recognize it, accept it, acknowledge it, and share it, you're not going to get out of it. It's not going to go away by itself. It's like certain physical conditions. I think a great number of physical conditions do just seem to go away by themselves, but some don't. Some you have to have treatment for, and the treatment has to be preceded by a diagnosis, and then an intention to get better. There's a certain will and skill there. So anyway, I thought maybe this chap had got more out of the course in a sense, on a certain scale, than many of the others. So distraction is the first thing we discover, and then, in that sense, as Freud says, we are all sick. We're all distracted. It's another way of understanding sin, rather than our legalistic view of sin, that sin is doing what we want to do but we're not allowed to do. A rather childish view of sin, like not eating sweets when we want to eat them. That isn't actually how we experience sin at all. Sin, according to St. Paul, is about a divided self. It's the addict who understands sin better than anybody. What I want to do is what I do not do, St. Paul says. What I don't want to do, that is what I find myself doing. Poor me, he says. This division within oneself is the great is the original sin, and it's the sickness of soul that we all have to deal with. So if that is the case, if distraction is the sort of primal imperfection or primal state of dis-ease, then attention, pure attention, which is the opposite of distraction, attention is healing. Attention is healthy. And attention leads to wholeness. When you begin to think of this in terms of a model of prayer that recognizes the prayer of the heart, or contemplative prayer, not just mental prayer, then it begins to make sense that the essence of prayer is attention, not intention, not wanting something. You do have to have an intention, otherwise you'd never sit down to meditate. But as soon as you have started to meditate, the intention has brought you so far, you then change gears. So intention is like, those of you who drive manual gears, it's like just going into the first gear to get moving. But then, as you start to build up a momentum, you go to higher gears, and when you go into fifth gear or overdrive, that's when you are in pure prayer. And that is pure attention. So the intention gets less and less intense, or you become less and less aware of it. It becomes more and more, as it were, second nature. You don't think about the intention, and it evolves or leads you into pure attention. So attention is healing and healthy. And anyone who has cared for anyone who is sick, or tried to be with someone who is suffering, will understand what that means. That to give your attention to someone in need, in pain, or in distress, is the first step. And sometimes it's the only thing, it's the only step you can take. Simone Weil says this, that when we are in a state of affliction, by which she means extreme suffering, the only thing we can give someone is attention, which becomes compassion. So, clearly if somebody's got a pain in their shoulder, you can maybe do something about it. You can either relieve the pain or you can deal with the source of the pain. But that isn't affliction. You can't write a prescription like those medical students thought you could do for people who are suffering tremendous loss, for example. Right? Those parents who lost their child. So, in the state of affliction, it is only attention we can give. But it's a lot to give. It makes a big difference. But it has to come from a pure heart. It has to come. We have to have the capacity to give attention. That's why we often, feel, and we've all felt it, I'm sure, when a friend has been in great distress, in great need, or maybe not even a friend, maybe somebody we don't know, in hospital or elsewhere we meet, and you don't know what to do. You don't know what to say, and you feel inadequate, because anything you say would be empty words, like they're in a better place. Or anything you do would seem like being condescending or distracting. So there is this feeling of helplessness very often when we're confronted with people in a state of great suffering. And sometimes we avoid people like that because we don't know what to do. And I think even people well trained and compassionate medical practitioners might feel the same. Well, okay, maybe I don't know what to do for this person, there's nothing more I can do for them, therefore I should use my time and go to the next bed where there's a prescription I can write. However, attention doesn't take up, you don't have to, we live in a real world with different, different responsibilities. We have to balance our responsibilities. I think I told you, some of you, once about when I was in Haiti and I visited this orphanage, and this little boy, maybe 2 or 3 years old, who had been abandoned. It was feeding time, and he was sitting in his cot and I was asked to take him some food. And he was in total withdrawal, total alienation, and crouching in the corner of the cot. And, I offered him the food and he pushed it back violently, pushed my hand away. So he'd been traumatized by abandonment and loss. And you could only imagine what was this psyche going to be like in 20 years' time. So, and I realized, what could you do? The only thing you can do is to give attention, to be patient, to be present, to keep offering, not to give up. Now, I only had a limited amount of time. I think there was a slight improvement in his responsiveness during the short time I was there, but I was helpless really to do more. But the Mother Teresa sisters were doing their best. But also, what we need is full attention. That's parental love, isn't it? Full attention. Privileged attention. So, nevertheless, a little can go a long way. And even in a busy medical, environment, or in the busy lives that people live, it's the quality of attention, rather than even the amount of time that you spend with the person, that makes the healing difference. And, I should end now. I wanted to end with this story of the healing story from the Gospel. And just imagine how long this encounter with Jesus took for Bartimaeus, the blind man, the blind beggar, in the crowd. So attention doesn't take, it's the quality of attention, the purity of attention, the present moment of attention that matters. And it's part of our own humility, part of our own limitations that, we're not God. We can't give unlimited, total attention to every suffering person in the world. But those we are with, we can do so. So attention is health, and it's part of the healing process itself. And that's why we all begin to feel better as soon as we receive attention, and of course, as soon as we give it as well. Well, let's end with the story from the Gospel of Mark. They reached Jericho, which is a symbol of the world in the Gospels. They reached Jericho, and as he left Jericho with his disciples and a large crowd, Bartimaeus, that is the son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting at the side of the road. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout and to say, "Son of David, Jesus, have pity on me." This became a form of the Jesus prayer later. And many of them scolded him and told him to keep quiet. But he only shouted all the louder, "Son of David, have pity on me." Jesus stopped and said, "Call him here." So they called the blind man. "Courage," they said, "get up, he's calling you." So, throwing off his cloak, he jumped up and went to Jesus. Then Jesus spoke, "What do you want me to do for you?" "Rabboni," the blind man said to him, "Master, let me see again." Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has healed you." And immediately his sight returned, and he followed him along the road. So just think about that story, the encounter, how brief it is, how single-minded the Bartimaeus' appeal is, how total. That's faith. It's not that he adhered to certain dogma or orthodoxy of belief. This is faith, this is pure connection, pure relationship. And remember the immediacy of Jesus' personal response. In this loud crowd, he was a little minor celebrity probably, formed a crowd around him, but with all that noise, he heard Bartimaeus' genuine appeal and called him, responded. So now there's a connection, and we'll see later that it's connections that heal. And then the question, because it is a relationship, it's not, Jesus wasn't looking at his computer when Bartimaeus comes into the room. He's saying, "What do you want me to do for you?" And Bartimaeus simply tells him, "I want to see again." And there's no procedure here. There's no laying on of hands or no words even. The healing takes place in and through this connection, this healing connection. And all that Jesus says is, "Okay, it's done, go. It's your faith has healed you. Your faith has been the power of this healing." But of course, the faith was a connection. So it's a powerful little story, and the more one reflects on what it's saying, I think the more it takes us into the understanding of healing.